Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining me this morning, Elliott. I'm sorry for the slight delay. For those that are looking properly, you'll notice that I'm not Harry Goulding. That's my son, but we've had to go through a different means from our normal Teams recording due to my terrible technical skills. So thank you for waiting for me, Elliott.
That's okay.
Very lucky to be joined by Elliott Gaspar this morning. We have started speaking recently on the back of the report we've produced on routes to the top of finance. And Elliott had a very interesting route to his current role as CFO, which is slightly different from other CFOs that I've spoken to recently, who may have gone down a more technical route and then moved across. During his career, Elliott has qualified in CIMA and then been very, very involved in raising private equity funds and gaining M&A experience on the way to where he is now at Standard Ledger. But I will let you tell them a bit more about yourself, Elliott, because I'm sure you'll do it better.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I think it's worth just saying a little bit about my career. So yes, I'm CIMA qualified. I've spent most of my life in operations and problem solving rather than technical accounting. And I'm now founding UK director of Standard Ledger, where we work with startup and scale up companies, and we function as their CFO, we function as their analyst, we function as what they need us to. For those founders to be able to grow their own businesses. So a little bit about me.
Good. Well, I think first thing we covered off is that in the report that we produced recently, it very much highlighted that commercial skills are probably the ones that future leaders think the next generation need to be gaining earlier in their career than perhaps was the case 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I guess the first thing that I was interested in are what you think the top two maybe skills that you've gained in your career that have helped you get where you are today.
Yeah, so definitely we're talking much more about commercial skills, especially in the startup world. So sort of there's two skills I would maybe talk about, and then the third maybe a trait, which I don't know if people can learn or not. So one is understanding data, right? So everything's data driven now. You need to know how to do drive a forecast based off a set of assumptions. You need to understand what a driver-based model is. You need to be able to question those data sets and understand where you're getting them from. So that's been really, really important in my career. And the second being an operator first and an accountant second. And what does that really mean, right? So it means you can't get hung up on what did we do last month? And I want to just repeat last month's process, right? Because progress in a business does not come from repeating what you already did in the past. And especially as we work with startups, that doesn't work so well. So being okay with changing how you do your processes and focusing on the outcomes. And we often hear investors or founders talk about progress rather than perfection. And that's what's really important in operating. And then the third thing is this trait, and that happens to be that I'm quite badly dyslexic, and it was picked up by my parents and by my school teachers very early in my school career as a child, and I was lucky that happened. And I went to lots of interventions and extra classes, and the downside to being dyslexic is that I need to put a bit more effort into writing and my writing skills, and I'm a fairly slow reader. I'm not one of those people that are sort of scanning the pages really quickly. I take my time over what I'm reading. But the major advantage that has helped my career a lot is that I seem to problem solve and think of new solutions differently to other people. And that's helped me become known as the solutions person, right? And if you can become the solutions person in your company, that's going to really help you. Because people are going to come to you for that problem solving, and that's going to help you step up and throughout your career. So if you can find a way of becoming the solutions guy, then do.
That's really interesting. That is kind of, you've turned something that could have been a hindrance into a massive advantage for you.
Yeah, we should never let anybody. I mention it actually because of that. I don't want anybody to think, oh, I'm dyslexic, therefore I can't be an accountant, right? In my case, being dyslexic has been a help to me way more than a hindrance in my career. So they should definitely still pursue a career in accounting.
Excellent. Okay. So another thing that came out of the report, which you've probably just highlighted, is this piece around data analysis. And I think one of the dangers is that sometimes when people are discussing it, it sounds as easy as use the technology and you'll become a CFO. I'm guessing that isn't quite the case. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, no, it's definitely not as easy as just use your systems, right? So we use a lot of systems at Standard Ledger. So we use Xero, we use Practice Ignition, we use a Trello card to control a sort of a global cost-effective team. But there's two things you need to know when you're using technology. You need to know why, and you need to know how. So the sort of the why are those the how are those pieces of technology that I've mentioned, right? You need to know what the tools are. You need to be reading about them. You need to understand their risks and what they do, and how you might connect them together. So we work with clients, for example, to connect their ERP to their CRM, to their other acronyms, to their payment systems, to their e-commerce systems. But you can't just go blindly into it. You have to understand why you're doing it, and that's about critical thinking. The ability to say why we're doing it, and what the risks are associated with it, and what my experience in implementing those systems have taught me. And you just need to you can't sort of learn that experience. You just need to go around and experience it, and eventually you'll be able to apply those critical thinking skills to it. And if you're an experienced finance leader in large corporate environments, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to suddenly be able to become a startup CFO. It's a very different world and a very different environment. So as startup CFOs, we need to be far more on the tools, and far more sort of aware of what's out there at operational and cash level. So if you're used to working in huge corporates, you rarely think about cash. Actually, if you think, you're just sort of in these organizations with deep pockets, whereas we're working with these startups, and we need to always think about being a cash hustler for our clients. So we developed through that a really deep experience of what works in a startup world, and we're very sort of in the coal face, I guess, at Standard Ledger, using these tools all the time. So it's not just simple, don't just do it. You got to think about it. You got to critically apply some skills to that.
So the report we put together gives advice on how people reach the top. It doesn't necessarily specify what the top is, or going into different sizes of organizations, which is something you've clearly just touched on. So if you're thinking purely from a startup perspective, how does somebody get to be the CFO of a startup?
It's a great question, and I think we did see it in the report a little bit about sort of how you might do that. So there are some links with traditional accounting. So one of those is you're going to need a qualification, right? You have to be a qualified accountant, professionally recognized. So mine is CIMA, as we spoke about. But that's sort of where the links with traditional accounting end if you want to go into the startup. So by traditional accounting, I guess I mean talking about P&Ls and balance sheets and month-end reporting, because that's very much reporting on what's already happened in a business, which for startups is not the key. The key in a startup is what's going to happen. What does tomorrow look like? What does my cash runway look like? And we need to be able to function in that looking forward role. So you might be talking about more than just the finances. You're talking about the operations as well. So you're looking at the data and you're saying a whole bunch of, so if you're in a SaaS startup, right? We have lots of clients that are SaaS startup businesses. Okay, well, you've got a whole host of subscriptions that are due to end any time, and that's going to negatively impact your cash flow. What are the steps we can do to lock in more revenue and secure a better cash in the next cycle? So that's the sort of differentiating factor when you're looking at accounting qualifications, and how to get into being a startup CFO is be used to looking forward, and have a good understanding of those backwards reports.
Okay. And how do you think somebody would know, because maybe you're making these decisions earlier in your career, maybe you're not, but how do you think somebody would be able to make the decision as to whether they want to be startup or they don't want to be startup?
Yes. So I think you just sort of know, right? If you know, you know. So if you really like the comfort blanket of large teams, of a big corporate that's got deep pockets and is always going to be able to make payroll, then probably startup isn't for you. If you want to work 9 to 5, startups are unlikely to be your career path. But if you do want to be more hands-on, if you want to work with some really exciting businesses that are sort of the forefront of the industries, then maybe startups are for you. If you want to work with founders, tackle really important challenges, and that they'll go on to do amazing things, and hopefully your own firm will go on to do amazing things, then it could be your bag. So for Standard Ledger, and for us, and for me personally, I feel really lucky to work with startups day in, day out. I'm working with some really interesting people who work really, really hard, and are driving their industries forward.
Okay, so it's probably more for the entrepreneurial finance professional.
Yeah, if you see yourself as an entrepreneur, as a founder, if you're sort of comfortable with taking risks, then it could be your career path.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, and in your own career, how did you develop the skills that you got to becoming that CFO startup material type person?
Yeah, so what were my skills that led me to this? There's probably two, and they're both about sort of disrupting. So when I went through my accountancy qualification, and you talk about key competencies, and there's a set of key competencies for accountants. And I don't know if it's the same in all the qualifications, but it was in CIMA, and one of them was skepticism. And I think a lot of people went through our qualification and just thought that was a thing to learn for your exam and then forget about it. But I took it forward with me. So I've always been highly skeptical, and I've combined that with my computer science background. So my degrees in computer science and process. And bringing those two things together meant that I was always looking for the best solution to a problem, and to really understand a problem. You know, where's this data come from? Why has this problem occurred? Who's telling me this, and why are they telling me that? And then I can come up with a solution to those problems and not worry about upsetting the boat, right? So, and this comes back to what we were mentioning earlier about, if all you want to do is do what you did last month, then it's more difficult to progress, right? So you're looking at solutions and saying, this is the best way to solve it. And it doesn't matter if you're upsetting the boat from a solution solving point of view. And for me, that's always been a key skill in startups. And you need to, it's hard to develop that within a large organization. So I used to work in very large organizations, you know, with 10,000 employees. And when you're in those sorts of environments, it's hard to take responsibility, and therefore take any risks with your decision making. So I had to leave those large organizations and start working in startups before I could really hone those skills. So working in small teams, so I worked in a very small team at Conrad Energy, was one of the first startups I worked in. And it means you have to take professional risks in those teams, and you need to be able to dive in. So I got lots of things wrong, and I made plenty of mistakes in that role, but I also owned those mistakes, and I came with a solution to them. So I was honest, got something wrong, here's what we do about it, this is why it's going to work this time. And over time, I got better and better at operating in that way. So I was exercising my skepticism, I was putting my computer science hat on, and I was solving those problems. And therefore, as I got better at it, I was sort of working with teams outside of finance. So I wasn't in a finance silo, and I got to see the world from a business decision point of view and not just from a finance point of view. And that's been really key to becoming a sort of a startup CFO. You need to talk about business, not just a finance perspective on business.
Okay. So you obviously also had to have some people above you potentially that would allow you to make the mistakes.
Yes.
Which is what I guess in a larger organization, maybe that's too stereotypical to say, but could be more difficult.
It is. Yeah, maybe we're doing a disservice to large organizations, right? I'm sure there are some that like to operate in that entrepreneurial way. But yeah, you need a boss who is going to let you make a mistake. And normally those are because they are entrepreneurs themselves. So they've got their own thing to do, and they're willing to give you responsibility to solve the problem.
Okay. Well, I know from our conversations before this, and as I said at the beginning, you've had a very varied and interesting career that's got you involved with lots of different aspects of business, as well as obviously finance. I guess it'd be interesting to know what some of those highlights have been for you so far.
Yeah, so it's thank you. It's a good question. So some of the sort of highlights in my career. So I just mentioned Conrad Energy. So Conrad Energy were one of the first startups I worked in. And I was part of a team that raised a really large private equity round for the company. So within a few years, I'd gone from never working in a startup to being a key part of a team. So I was doing the financial modeling, I led the analysis, and I led on stakeholder engagement as well. And we managed to raise hundreds of millions of dollars for the company, which was incredible. I was surrounded by a really capable team. They were some of the smartest people I've worked with. But I was allowed to own and really get to grips with my own part of that fundraise. And I'm just really grateful to Conrad Energy for letting me do that, because it taught me so much about private equity. It taught me so much about deal making, term sheets, and all of that. And then, so other highlights. So recently just joining Standard Ledger, right? So I'm founding UK director of Standard Ledger. Standard Ledger grew up in Australia, where they've sort of taken over and dominated the market in Australia as the leading startup and scale-up accountancy firm. We now launched in the UK after they helped a lot of their Aussie clients set up in the UK. So I'm getting to enjoy that sort of building a business around an established brand and process, while at the same time I work with startups day in, day out, which I just love doing, and I'm just really passionate about that. So I also think it's just never going to be a boring job.
Yeah. And you got business development in that as well, haven't you, for yourself? Or
Yes, so business development. So we're launching from the beginning. So we're now getting involved in everything that I'm getting to do. So we are growing the business from marketing, sales, process. We're learning the difference between operating in Australia and operating in UK.
Yeah.
It's been really important. So it just comes back to those other skills. It's looking outside of the finance team. And I think the best CFOs I've worked with throughout my career, I've worked some poor ones, and I've worked with some great ones. And the great ones are the ones that know about business and they know how to look outside of their own team.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So one of the other things that came out of the report, which I guess may be an obvious, but is that not many careers go completely and utterly smoothly. So there will be some downsides or some harder times. Have you got any career, I don't know if lows is the right word, but struggles that you would look
career
at?
Lows? Oh gosh, I think everybody goes through career lows. And you have to, because you're not taking risks, you're not progressing. So and there's probably two I would talk about. And those are around people. And I've always been really passionate about teams and about leading teams and helping people grow and develop in their own roles. And I think that's actually how we got talking, right? Because it's a subject that I'm passionate about. But both of probably my biggest lowlights were around teams and hiring. So one was a sad case where I put forward somebody I knew for a role within my team. And he was known to the whole team, actually, and they joined us. And this individual sort of sat next to me for several months. We all were mentoring them. We were all coaching them. And they ended up leaving the business under a gross misconduct situation, which is never easy to happen to you. Our team had access to privileged information. This person was found to be abusing that privilege. And they left under that sort of cloud. And it was really disheartening. You think you're putting your best into these people and you put them forward for the role. And I actually acted as his own reference to my own team, which was sort of a weird situation, but he'd abused that trust. And the takeaways I learned from that, and when you have these mistakes, it's really important that you find what the learning is in it. Sure, be a bit upset and whatever, but just take away the learning. And in that situation, it was that we have controls and process for a reason in finance. It's not just finance people being finance. And those controls and process was why the person's activities were discovered before anything sort of went wrong. And we were able to deal with the situation. The second low was, again, more hiring. And in this situation, it was a really great guy, actually. He's still a friend of mine. He transferred teams. So he was in an adjoining team and he transferred it into being part of my team that I was leading. And because I hadn't hired him directly, I hadn't gone through those normal steps you do, right? So when you're hiring, you talk about what's your career development, what do you want to learn about, what's your professional development plan. where do you want to be in 5 years? That annoying question that everybody asks at an interview. None of that had happened, and I just sort of thought, oh, I know the guy because he's been in the adjoining team, and we've had coffee breaks together for the last few months. So I just know the chap. So I didn't bother with those steps, and that was the mistake. So within 3 months of joining my team, he'd handed in his notice, which was entirely my fault because he wasn't getting development, he wasn't learning, and he wasn't going to get where he wanted to go. And from that, again, I've taken a learning. Don't just assume that you understand somebody's goals because you tangentially had coffee with them and your friends outside of work. You make sure you're always understanding what your team are trying to achieve themselves, because they're probably on their own path to wanting to be CFO. They're on their own path to whatever it is they're trying to get to, right? They're on their own path. And as a leader, you should be enabling that. And you can't enable it unless you know what it is they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, if I think back to my own career, I've made those mistakes as well, and it's difficult, and it's easy to meet somebody that you know or have known that you know has got great experience that you really want to be in your team because you think you get on well and you can work together, without really thinking about what the next stages of that are. So yeah, quite easily done, but painful when it happens as well, especially personal relations. Yeah,
it does. And I think also the reason that the hiring ones and the team-based mistakes stay with you is because they're the hardest to rectify, I think, right? So if you make a mistake in the data or reporting or anything else that we get involved, it's sort of normally you can solve it in a few hours, a few days, and you can fix it. Make a mistake in your hiring process, and that's normally a big impact on a business.
Yeah.
So really take that seriously.
Definitely. Okay, so just thinking back to something you said earlier, and also the way, again, it kind of relates not just to the report we've just done, but everything we've seen since the pandemic. There's obviously a bigger emphasis these days on what should we call it, work-life balance, or however people want to phrase it. And I think that within the routes to the top, people are hoping that flexible working actually could help certain people get there quicker. For instance, in the report, it highlighted a big discrepancy between the numbers of women and men that had reached the top of finance. And a major reason for that, or that was being highlighted, was probably around maternity, flexibility, children in that stage of people's career. You mentioned that if you want to be 9 till 5, then maybe a startup role isn't going to be for you. But I guess part of the problem people have seen in the past is maybe burnout. So
yeah,
do you think in the startup world there's a way of avoiding burnout, or how would you avoid it?
Yeah, no, I think a couple of really interesting points, Ray. So I'm gonna try and answer 2 points there, I guess. Yeah. Right. One is
the longest way of saying something ever. So sorry.
It was a long question, and I didn't even make any notes. I feel like I need somebody next to me making notes. Because just in your question, we mentioned about work-life balance. Yeah. And I think, especially as the world moves forward, we can divorce the idea of work-life balance and burnout, right? I think those are two separate things. So I work hard, and you do work hard in startups, and you do a lot of hours. But I have a young family. So, for example, I've got a little toddler. He goes to nursery, but I do nursery drop-off each morning, right? And I'm able to do that, and that takes me, to what would be a traditional 9 to 5 hours. I wouldn't be able to do it. And I try to be present as much as I can for things like bedtime and how we spend our time on the weekends. But the modern world, post-pandemic, it's easier, and especially within finance startups, it's easier to sort of set your own hours, right? So I don't mind working in the evening after my toddler's in bed. I don't mind working in the morning before we go to nursery. I'm able to set my own hours a bit more flexibly. Which I think is just a reason. Maybe that's just a plug for going into startups. So I just want to divorce that from burnout, because I think they're two things. And then burnout is a big problem, and it's something you do see. I think probably more working in startups than you might see in corporate jobs. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe somebody that you talk to from a corporate world will say that I was talking rubbish, but I feel like it's probably more prevalent in startups. And we do see it. It comes a little bit with that territory. It's because of the passion. And it's because founders And Standard Ledger is led by founders and for founders. So we see this a bit. You get very passionate, you get very hardworking on your product, you get very hardworking on your solutions. But it comes with a bit of experience. So after 7 years, and my Aussie founders have been doing sort of startups for as long as I have, you sort of find ways to cope with that, and you look out for it. So for me personally, I tend to really double down and get really hardworking when there's a new problem or a new solution set to be found. And I just try to keep an eye on how many hours I'm doing, when I'm doing them, and take time to step back and work with my and stop working and spend time with my family, because I'm only working so that I can have time with my family, right? I'm not I don't want to just work and not spend time with my wife or spend time with my toddler. So you have to be able to step back from it. But it's one of those things, it's just, you're going to learn more about it as your career goes through, and you'll start to see the signs in your friends, in your co-workers, and in yourself. And by the time you get to your second, your third startup, hopefully you found a way around it, or you're going to have to step back from startup life.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So the other thing the report showed is that there's a relatively large percentage of finance leaders that don't see themselves still in finance in 5-10 years time, and therefore the time is there for the next generation. For some of that, it might be because they've worked for longer than we have so far and are ready for retirement. For others, it's because they want to go and do something different. Where do you see yourself in 10 years?
So in 10 years, I think I'd still like to be leading sort of Standard Ledger, right? Sort of Standard Ledger's UK arm, whether or not we've also expanded elsewhere within Europe at that point. I think it's a huge market. There's a lot happening in the UK startup scene. And sort of what keeps us going is that there's always new startups happening. There's a new problem to be solved. There's new industries getting invented, right? So if I was working in startups 15 years ago, would I have ever known about something like Uber and Lyft sharing, right? A whole industry was created and invented by a startup. So it's really exciting to me just to think what's going to happen in the next 10 years, what are the startups going to be, and what are the tools that we're going to be using at that time, right? Am I going to be embedded in AI? Am I going to be using new, I don't know, solutions we don't know about to wrap our services around our clients? So we talk about wrapping services around our clients. And we'll start to keep learning about those, and I'll keep trying to stay on the frontier of accounting in that way in the next 10 years, but I'll be operating as much as a CEO, as much as a CFO, and as an advisor to startups as well in the next 10 years, hopefully.
Okay. Which leads me to my last question, actually. So our report definitely did not give an answer to the question of how prevalent people think AI and other tools will be within finance. There was from people saying 0 out of 10 to 10 out of 10 is how much of an impact it would have. So it'd be interesting to know from you, and not just with AI, but where you think finance accountancy might be in 10 years, 5-10 years time.
Okay, yeah. So I guess I'm not overly surprised there wasn't a solid answer on it, right? Because I think there is a few schools of thought, and maybe some of those schools of thought are more heavily weighted towards those older in their career, or more mature in their career, I should say, and those who are sort of working at the beginning of their career, and also there's a divide in industry as well. So I think over 10 years or so, we're going to see a duality exist within the finance profession. And that dividing line is probably going to come down to large corporates versus smaller, scrappier startups. So if I take the example of an AR and an AP team, okay, and I'm going to think a little bit just mostly about AI in this sense. Do I think in 10 years time we're going to have AR and AP teams that look like they do today? I would be really surprised, right? Invoice processing is very rules driven. It's very data driven, and that makes it something that's replaceable by AI in the shorter term, because as we've seen with tools like Bard and ChatGPT, if it's rules driven, if there's a data set to learn off, it can probably solve that. And these new tools are also going to be able to understand tax jurisdictions and company structures, right? So one of the sort of negatives you hear about is, oh, well, we've got our own company structure and we've got our own projects and we've got our own, however it is you set up your financial system. In the end, those aren't that complicated, right? They're complex, but they're not that complicated that they won't be able to solve them. So smaller organizations, startups who are driven by efficiency are going to see major changes, whereas larger organizations, which are maybe a bit more risk adverse, that are slower to change, and the ones I used to work in, I used to sort of describe as a huge, great big container ship, right? You can't just turn the ship. It takes its time. I think in 10 years, they'll still be grappling with some of these changes. They'll still be talking about risk policies and committee meetings to decide where they're going to take it. And so you'll end up with more of a divide between CFOs and senior finance professionals and accountants in large organizations that are resisting tools, and the ones that are in smaller organizations that are embracing them. But it's probably easy to talk about AR and APE, but there's more complex areas as well. So things you see in private equity-backed businesses that I've been in, and you get them in large corporates as well, where you have complicated group structures. You'll have intercompany invoicing in those structures. You'll have group consolidations. You'll have intercompany loans that all exist. I don't think that's going to be necessarily person-driven in the next 10 years still. It's a more difficult problem than AR and AP, but it's not that complicated, right? So there's still context and rule-driven. So if in the environment of X, if Y happens, then do Z, and then update the intercompany loan documents, for example, right? And that's all something that can be solved, I think, by an AI within the next 10 years. So sort of as we're sort of leading up to like this final question, so I might just go on a little bit and stop me when I've spoken for too long. And I think we're going to see traditional accounting roles start to phase out, because you're just seeing things like intercompanies consolidations get automated. You're seeing invoicing get automated. You're seeing intercompany loans start to get automated. That role of an accountant as the record keeper, right? And that's sort of where accountancy started in the world, was record keeping. That was its main function, which I don't think it is anymore. And I'm pleased it's not anymore. But I think we'll see record keeping as a role of an accountant start to move on. And it will only exist in some industries, in those larger resistant to change industries. And the rest of us will be sort of remaining agile and moving forward and onto new problems. So the startup CFO of 10 years will probably be using the latest tools, just like we use the latest tools of today. And we're trying to pioneer how to do that and take the right calculated risks using those critical thinking skills. And a career in accountancy will probably start to change because of it. So I have known qualified accountants that have spent their whole career invoice processing. And I don't see that being a valid career path for an accountant going forward. It's a completely valid one now, right? Absolutely nothing against people that have done that. It's been a great career and it's been a great life for them. But I see it as a difficult path to choose as an accountant going forward. So if you're going to become an accountant, and if you're at your early stages of your career right now, or you think of going into the profession, I think go into it expecting that you're going to have to know more about business. You're going to have to operate quicker. You're going to have to be a problem solver. You're going to want to get hands-on, and you're going to want to hustle more. And it's going to be less about watching the same reports get churned out at the end of each month. So we should, maybe this is a call to action to accountants out there who want to operate in startups. Don't be scared of change. Embrace the exciting edge of what's possible in accounting. And I'm sure as I age, I'll start to say things like, back in my day, you had to have a person do this and then that's better, right? But I'm going to try to resist that attitude as long as I can. And I feel those going into the profession should have that same attitude. We should be embracing these tools and take those calculated risks. And the real leaders are the people who see the path forward rather than those who are sort of dragged forward.
Yeah. I mean, again, that pretty much fits in with the report overall, whether that's about the AI piece, but about how finance has changed so much. But I mean, I'm sure I've said to you, I've been doing this since 1999. And in that 24 years or whatever it is now, the report has completely changed already. But I do feel like there is a massive acceleration happening at the moment. So it'd be interesting. But yeah, if you don't go with it, I think eventually you will get left behind. Whether that's in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, we'll have to wait to see. But it's
I mean, who knows? You can't predict it, right? The rate of change, and you're just going to be prepared for the change, I think.
Yeah, no, completely. Brilliant. Well, thank you for doing this with us. I do appreciate it. I know it's probably been 2 months in the making now, so and your life's changed hugely. We're getting married in between and all of those things.
Yes.
As well. So, yeah, but I really do appreciate you taking the time out, and I'm sure that this will be found very useful to those that are on a career path. And you might get a few people reaching out to you saying, right, I want to be in the startups going forward.
Yeah, no, I mean, please do. I mean, if you're watching this and you've survived until the end of the recording, congratulations. But please do reach out if there's anything I can do. Standard Ledger and myself are always happy to sort of talk startups and accounting and what's happening in this space.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Great to talk.